If my mother died in 1978, who kept leaving pieces of her life behind? The bank was closing for good. 50 years of dust, 50 years of signatures, 50 years of secrets being slid into drawers and forgotten in the dark. By noon, the front doors of Miller's National Bank would lock for the last time. Men in work boots were already hauling out file boxes. Dollies squeaked across the marble floor. Metal carts rattled. The air smelled like paper, cold brass, and that strange dry scent old buildings get right before they're emptied forever. And at 8:14 that morning my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. Unknown number, local. I was standing in my kitchen in socks, holding a coffee mug that had already gone lukewarm, watching rain stripe the window over the sink. The sky was the color of old dishwater. The house was quiet except for the ticking wall clock and the low hum of the refrigerator. Then I answered. A woman said, "Miss Carter, this is Evelyn from Miller's National Bank. We've found an unclaimed safe deposit box under your mother's name." I remember gripping the mug harder. Because my mother had been dead for almost 50 years, or that's what I had been told. The woman kept talking, her voice careful now, office soft, like she had already heard the silence on my end and understood she had stepped into something delicate. "We're closing permanently today," she said. "As part of the final inventory, we located box 412. The records list your mother, Helen Carter, as the owner. Since no one ever claimed the contents, they now legally pass to next of kin." I stared at the rain. I could hear it tapping the glass, a slow, uneven sound, like fingertips, and all I could think was this: dead women don't rent safe deposit boxes. My mother died in a car crash in October of 1978. That was the story. It had always been the story. Rainy highway, lost control. Car went off the road. Fire. Closed casket. I was 6 years old, too young to ask the right questions, old enough to remember the smell of black umbrellas and wet wool at the funeral. Old enough to remember my father's hand on my shoulder. Heavy, certain, final, so I asked the woman to repeat herself. She did, slower this time. "Helen Carter," she said. "Box 412. I looked over at the hallway, at the framed photo I kept on the side table. The one of my mother holding me in the backyard when I was a toddler, summer light on her face. Her hair pinned back badly because she was laughing too hard to care. I had seen that picture 1,000 times, maybe more. It had become less like a memory and more like a window I could never step through. I said there must be some mistake, and the woman answered, "I thought that too, but the paperwork matches." Then she said the one sentence I would keep hearing in my head for the rest of that day. "It hasn't been touched since 1978. I wish I could tell you I handled that calmly, that I asked smart questions, that I became one of those clear-headed women in mystery stories who immediately starts connecting dots. I didn't. I just stood there in my kitchen with cold coffee in my hand and felt something old and buried shift beneath my feet. Because grief has weight. Real weight. You build your life on top of it, carefully, year by year, habit by habit. You learn where not to step. You learn what not to touch. And when something reaches up from under it, when a dead person's name suddenly appears in the present tense, it doesn't feel dramatic. It feels nauseating. By 10 o'clock, I was driving across town in the rain. Miller's National Bank sat at the end of Main Street like it had been waiting to outlive everyone. Limestone front, tall narrow windows, tarnished bronze handles on the doors. The town around it had changed. Pharmacy turned into a vape shop, diner turned into a tax office, the old movie theater gutted into storage, but the bank had stayed the same. Proud, square, quiet in a way that felt almost judgmental. The parking lot was half empty. A moving truck idled near the side entrance. 2 men carried out gray file cabinets with the careful, strained walk of people moving things that matter to someone else. Inside, the bank sounded wrong. Banks are supposed to sound hushed, carpeted, controlled. This one sounded like an ending, tape guns snapping, drawers slamming, boots on stone. A copier being dragged across the floor with a low, scraping groan that made my teeth hurt. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the whole place smelled like dust shaken loose after decades of sitting still. At the front desk, a woman in a navy cardigan looked up and gave me a tired smile. Evelyn, I guessed. She had the expression of someone who had spent all morning helping strangers sort through things they had forgotten to feel. "Miss Carter?" she asked. I nodded. She came around the desk, offered a hand, then seemed to think better of it. "Thank you for coming in. I know this is unusual." Unusual. That was one word for it. She led me past the teller windows, past a waiting area stacked with old promotional calendars and empty brochure racks, and toward the vault in the back. The vault door was already open. Huge, circular, steel bolts thick as wrists. It looked less like a bank and more like the entrance to something buried. My shoes clicked on the tile as I followed her inside. Rows of safe deposit boxes climbed the walls in neat brass grids. Most were open now, their little doors hanging loose, the contents already removed. The room was cool, close. It smelled like iron, paper, and the faint sour note of old adhesive. Evelyn stopped near the lower middle row. She pointed, 412. The number was small, unremarkable, stamped into metal. But the second I saw it, I felt my pulse in my throat. She slid a tiny envelope from a file and removed a key attached to a yellowing paper tag. "We found this in archived holdings," she said. "It was stored separately after a delinquency review in the early 80s. Honestly, we almost missed it." "Delinquency?" I asked. She glanced at the paperwork. There were years when payment lapsed, then resumed, then lapsed again. I looked at her. "Resumed by who?" She hesitated. "That's part of what's strange. The authorization notes are incomplete." There it was, the first crack, not just a box someone had tried somehow to keep alive. My mouth went dry. Evelyn crouched, inserted the bank key, then stood and gestured for me to use the second key. My hand shook when I took it. The metal was colder than I expected. For one absurd second, I noticed the smell of my own rain-damp coat and the distant squeal of a dolly outside the vault and thought, this is how the world sounds right before it changes. I knelt. The brass faceplate was scratched, not badly, just enough to suggest years. Use, contact, human hands. I put the key in, turned it. There was a soft click. Evelyn pulled the narrow metal drawer free and carried it to a small private table against the wall. She set it down between us with both hands, almost respectfully, then stepped back. "That's everything," she said quietly. The drawer was no larger than a loaf pan, dark inside. Still, I stared at it. I don't know how long, a few seconds maybe. Maybe a lifetime compressed into one breath. Because in that moment, before I saw what was inside, I still had choices. It could be a paperwork error. It could be boring. It could be meaningless. My mother could stay dead in the neat, familiar way she had always been dead. I reached in, and the first thing my fingers touched was a ring. A plain gold wedding band, not bent, not burned, not damaged, smooth and cool against my skin. And the instant I lifted it into the light, I knew one thing with a certainty that made my stomach drop. My mother already had a wedding ring. At home, in my jewelry box. I stood there in the vault holding that ring between two fingers like it might explain itself if I stared hard enough. It was plain, gold, no stone, no engraving on the outside, just a narrow band with the kind of quiet weight real gold has, not flashy, not ornate, warm even in the cold vault light. And all I could think was, my mother already had a wedding ring. I knew exactly where it was, top drawer of my bedroom dresser at home, inside a walnut jewelry box lined with faded blue velvet, wrapped in a handkerchief that still smelled faintly like rose powder and cedar whenever I unfolded it. I had opened that box maybe 100 times over the years, on birthdays, on bad nights, on anniversaries I pretended I didn't remember and always did. Her ring had always been there, so why was there another one, I looked up at Evelyn. "This can't be hers," I said, but even as I said it, I knew I didn't believe myself, because the ring looked old in exactly the right way. Not antique, not decorative, just lived in. A ring that had been worn while folding laundry, washing dishes, opening car doors, brushing hair back from a hot forehead. A ring from a real marriage, a real life. Evelyn didn't say anything. She had learned, I think, that some moments go bad when another person speaks into them. So I reached back into the box. Under the ring was a photograph, a Polaroid. Its white border had yellowed with age, and one corner was bent soft, like someone had once held it too tightly. The image itself had faded into that dreamy wash old Polaroids get, where the colors look more remembered than real. But not so faded that I couldn't see her, my mother, Helen Carter. She was younger than I'd ever known her, and somehow not. Her hair was pinned back loosely. She wore a light-colored blouse with the collar open. Summer, maybe, or the kind of room that traps summer inside it. She was sitting in a chair by a window, and sunlight was falling across one side of her face. Soft, gold, quiet. And in her arms was a baby, not me. I knew that instantly, not because memory is perfect, it isn't. Mine comes in fragments, light on linoleum, the smell of ivory soap, my mother humming with her back turned. But I knew it wasn't me because I had seen every surviving photo of myself as a child. Every one. My father kept them in albums labeled in his square, careful handwriting. I knew the dresses, the blankets, the dates. I knew my own baby face the way people know a scar on their own skin. This child was younger than I had ever been in the photos with her, tiny, wrapped in a pale blanket, one small fist visible, dark hair. And my mother was looking down at that baby with an expression that made my chest tighten. Not posed, not polite, not for the camera, it was love. Immediate, protective, bone-deep love. I turned the photo over. At first I thought the back was blank. Then I tilted it under the fluorescent light and saw the ink, faded blue, handwritten. 4 words for when she asks, that was it. No name, no date, no explanation, just those 4 words for when she asks. I read them again, then again. A strange cold spread through me. Not the clean cold of the vault, something older, something from childhood, the feeling of standing in a room where adults had just stopped talking because you walked in, the feeling that a truth had been moved out of your reach before you even knew it existed. "Do you need a moment?" Evelyn asked softly. I almost laughed. A moment. What I needed was 30 years backward, maybe 40. I needed my father alive. I needed answers from people who had already gone into the ground carrying them. I needed my 6-year-old self to have asked better questions at a funeral. She barely understood. Instead, I nodded and reached for the last item in the box. It was folded once down the center. Thin paper, stiff with age, a bus ticket. My fingers didn't want to open it. That sounds dramatic, but it's true. There are moments when your body understands danger before your mind does. My hands had already figured out that whatever was inside this box did not want to stay in the past. I unfolded the ticket carefully. The print was faded but legible. Spokane to Seattle, 1 passenger. Departure date, October 17, 1978. I stopped breathing for a second. My mother's funeral had been on October 14. I know that because the date sat in our family Bible for years, written in my father's hand. Because every October, whether I wanted to or not, my body remembered rain and black shoes and the smell of damp chrysanthemums. Because grief brands dates into you. October 14, and here in my hand was a ticket dated 3 days later, 3 days after we buried her. Dead women don't buy bus tickets. I looked at all 3 objects laid out on the little table under the buzzing vault light. The ring, the photo, the ticket, 3 things, that was all. And together they were somehow worse than a box full of letters, because letters explain, letters ramble, letters soften. These didn't. These were hard things, sharp things, objects that didn't ask for interpretation so much as force it. A second ring, a stranger's baby, a trip after death. There was no version of my life where those three things made sense together, unless the story I had been told was false. I heard myself say it before I fully meant to. My mother didn't go to Seattle. It came out flat, almost childish, like I was trying to scold the paper into changing. Evelyn glanced at the ticket, then back at me. I'm sorry, that's not what I said. But it was, really, because the sentence underneath the one I said was louder. My mother was dead, and underneath that one was the sentence I still couldn't let fully form, unless she wasn't. I gathered the three items slowly, as if moving too fast might trigger some trap in time. Evelyn brought me a small evidence-style envelope and a release form. My signature looked wrong on the page. Wobbly, narrow, like someone else's hand had borrowed mine. Before I left, I asked the only question my brain could arrange. Has anyone ever asked about this box before? Evelyn hesitated, and that hesitation hit me harder than anything else. Not in person, she said. I looked at her. What does that mean? She checked the file again. There were notes, a few inquiries over the years, mostly incomplete, one phone call in the 80s, one forwarding request that was never finalized, then nothing for a long time. My throat tightened. Who called? I don't know, the records don't say. Male, female. They didn't write it down. There it was again, that feeling, like I had arrived late to a conversation about my own life. Was it my father? She shook her head slightly. I can't tell from this. Then she added, almost reluctantly, but whoever it was, they knew the box existed. Outside, the rain had eased into a fine silver mist. I stood under the bank's stone awning with the envelope tucked under my arm and watched Main Street blur at the edges. Tires hissed over wet pavement. The old traffic light clicked through its colors for almost no one. Somewhere down the block, a delivery truck beeped in reverse. The town smelled like wet asphalt, coffee drifting from the diner, and the metallic scent that rises after rain. Everything looked exactly the same. That felt insulting, because mine had just changed. I drove home too slowly, then too fast, then too slowly again. At a red light near the post office, I took the photo back out and looked at my mother's face. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking at the baby. And that bothered me more than it should have, because it felt intimate in a way none of the framed family photos at home ever had. In our family pictures, my mother was always arranged, smiling because the moment required smiling, holding still because that was what people did when they wanted to prove something looked normal. But this image had no audience in it, no performance, just tenderness. Whoever took that picture had been close enough to catch her unguarded, who had seen that version of her, and why had I never known about it? By the time I got home, the clouds had thinned just enough to let a weak strip of afternoon light fall across the living room floor. Dust floated in it like shaken powder. The house smelled faintly of books, radiator heat, and the lemon oil I used on the wood furniture when I was avoiding bigger thoughts. I didn't take off my coat. I went straight to the bedroom. The jewelry box was where it had always been. Dresser right side, walnut wood, one hinge slightly loose. My father had given it to me on my 16th birthday, and told me it had belonged to my mother, though now I couldn't remember whether I had ever verified that or simply accepted it because children, even grown children, are trained to accept the version handed to them by the surviving parent. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. The velvet inside had faded from blue to something almost gray. Earrings, a brooch, a single pearl button, and there, wrapped in the old handkerchief, was the ring I had always believed was hers. I unwrapped it carefully. Then I set the ring from the bank beside it. For one dizzy second they looked identical. Then they didn't. The ring from my jewelry box was slightly thicker, warmer in color, worn flat on the underside where it had rested against skin for years. Inside, there was an inscription so faint I had to hold it near the window to read it. H to T always. My father's name was Thomas. The ring from the bank had no inscription, no flattening underneath, less wear, like it had been worn, yes, but not for the same life, Not for as long. I stared at them side by side on the bedspread while the light slowly shifted and the room grew colder. 2 rings. 1 marriage. Or maybe not. That thought came in so quietly it took me a second to realize how explosive it was. Maybe 1 ring belonged to my mother, and the other belonged to a woman I had never been allowed to know. I picked up the Polaroid again and turned it over, for when she asks, who was she? Me, the baby, someone else? And if this had been meant for me, if my mother had left this behind for a future version of me, then she had expected there would come a day when I would start asking questions no one else wanted answered. That realization sat in my chest like a stone, because I had asked questions once. Not many, but enough to remember the way they landed. I remembered being 7, maybe 8, sitting at our kitchen table while my father read the newspaper. The morning light had been thin and pale. The radiator hissed. I had asked why we never visited my mother's grave in the rain, only in summer. He lowered the paper and looked at me in a way that made me feel I had made some invisible mistake. Because some things are hard enough without making them harder, he said. I didn't ask again for a long time. Later, when I was older, I asked why there were so few photographs of the funeral. He said, "Do you really want those in the house?" When I asked why no one ever talked about the crash in detail, he said, "Because decent people don't live inside tragedy forever." That was his way. He never shouted, never needed to. He ended conversations by making questions feel impolite, wasteful, a kind of disloyalty. And now here I was, 40-something years later, sitting on my bed with proof that either my father had lied to me, or the universe had developed a very specific sense of cruelty. The house phone rang. I jumped so hard one of the rings tipped and rolled across the quilt. I caught it before it fell. The caller ID showed a local number I didn't recognize. For a second, I just stared at it. Then I answered. A man's voice said, "This is going to sound strange, but were you at Miller's National this morning?" I stood up slowly. "Who is this?" He cleared his throat. His voice had the rough, older texture of someone who had spent a lifetime around tools or engines or dust. "Name's Eddie Flores. I used to do maintenance there. Locks, hinges, old vault drawers, that kind of thing. Evelyn told me your mother's name." Every muscle in my shoulders tightened. "What do you want?" There was a pause. Then he said, quieter now, "I think your mother came back for that box once." I stopped moving. The room went so still I could hear the radiator click. Outside, a car passed on the wet street with a soft shhh sound. Somewhere in the house, the old fridge compressor kicked on. Ordinary noises. Wrong moment. I tightened my grip on the phone. "What did you just say?" And Eddie answered. "I said, I don't think that box was forgotten. I think somebody wanted it found." I didn't speak for a second. Not because I didn't hear him, because I did. Too clearly. The phone was warm against my ear. My other hand still held the unmarked ring from the bank, and suddenly it felt heavier than gold should feel. "I'm sorry," I said finally. "You think my mother did what?" On the other end of the line, the man, Eddie Flores, let out a slow breath through his nose, like he already regretted calling but had crossed too far into it to stop. "I'm not saying I'm certain," he said. "I'm saying I remember something, and after Evelyn told me your name, that memory started bothering me." I stayed standing beside the bed. The late afternoon light had gone flat and gray. The room smelled faintly of rain-damp wool from my coat, and the dusty sweetness of old velvet from the jewelry box. "What memory?" "A woman," he said, late 70s, maybe early 80s, came in asking about a box she said she couldn't access yet. My pulse kicked harder. "That doesn't mean it was my mother." "No," he said. "It doesn't, but you think it was." A pause. "Yeah," he said, "I do." I sat down slowly. There is a certain kind of fear that doesn't feel sharp. It feels muffled, like the world has been wrapped in heavy fabric. That was what this was. Not panic. Not yet. Something stranger. The sensation that reality had begun moving a few inches to the left, while everything still looked the same. "What exactly do you remember?" I asked. Eddie cleared his throat. "Look, It's not much over the phone, and I don't want to hand you a half-story that gets bigger in your head than it should. Too late for that. I looked at the 2 rings on the bedspread, one with my father's inscription inside, one without it. How did you get my number? Evelyn wasn't supposed to give it to me, he said. So maybe don't mention that part. I almost laughed. Almost? Instead I said, you called me for a reason. I did. Then tell me. He hesitated again. I could hear faint kitchen sounds behind him. A radio maybe. The clink of ceramic. The small domestic noises of a normal life. That, for some reason, made me trust him more than if he'd sounded polished. I remember a woman wearing a green coat, he said. That's the first thing. Wool, dark green, wet at the shoulders like she'd come in from rain. She was standing near one of the side desks while Mr. Talbot, old manager back then, spoke to her in a voice so low I couldn't hear words. But I remember her hands. My throat tightened. What about them? She kept one hand over the other like she was trying to stop herself from reaching for something. He let that sit. Then he said, some people come into banks angry, some come in scared. This woman wasn't either. She looked split, like half of her wanted to run and half of her had already decided she couldn't. A chill moved through me, because that sounded like my mother. Or maybe it sounded like every woman who has ever stood at the edge of a decision she won't survive unchanged. And you remember her face? I asked. Not cleanly, Eddie said. Not enough to swear in court, but enough that when Evelyn said Helen Carter, I got that old feeling. The kind you get when a song you haven't heard in 40 years comes on and you somehow still know the next line. I closed my eyes. My mother in a green coat, rain on the shoulders, a bank she was supposed to have stopped existing in. Why didn't she open the box? I asked. Don't know. I just remember Mr. Talbot telling her there were procedures, that there were conditions, that she'd have to wait. Wait for what? I almost said it out loud. Instead I asked, did she come alone? Far as I know. Did she leave a name? Not where I could see. Then how can you be sure it was her? I'm not sure, he said again. But I am sure of this. That box didn't stay active by accident. The radiator gave a hard metallic click. Outside, the light was slipping away fast now, and the window had turned the color of watered milk. I could see my faint reflection in it. A woman holding a phone like it might burn her. A bed behind her with 2 rings laid side by side like evidence. What do you mean active? I mean somebody kept paying on it, not regularly, not cleanly, but enough to keep it from being emptied sooner. I leaned forward. Evelyn told me there were lapses. Yeah, he said, there were. But that's what makes it stranger, not less. Whoever was doing it wasn't rich and they weren't organized, but they were persistent. The room suddenly felt too small. What kind of payments? Cash some years. Money order once, maybe twice. One note in a file, handwritten. My grip tightened on the phone. What note? Another pause. I only saw it once, a long time ago, might not even be there anymore. What did it say? His voice dropped. Hold until she's old enough. I couldn't breathe, not properly. My chest expanded, but the air stopped somewhere high and useless. I put the ring down before I dropped it. The words from the back of the Polaroid flashed through me, for when she asks, and now this. Hold until she's old enough. Not a mistake, not random, not clerical. Intent. Whoever placed those objects in the box had not hidden them forever. They had timed them. Why didn't anyone tell me? I whispered. Eddie didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had changed. Softer. Sadder. In towns like this, he said, people don't always protect the truth. They protect the version that keeps everybody functional. That sentence landed so hard I had to look away, even though there was no one there to see me do it. Because that was my childhood in one line. The version that keeps everybody functional. Not happy. Not healed. Functional. I thought of my father at the breakfast table with his ironed shirts and folded newspaper and measured voice. I thought of how clean grief had always been in our house. Never messy. Never loud. My mother's death had been treated like a framed photograph. Visible, respected, never examined too closely. I said my father would have known. It didn't come out as a question. Eddie was quiet for a moment. Then, maybe, a small word, cowardly almost, but I heard what lived inside it. Yes, or close enough to yes to hurt. I stood up and began pacing without realizing it. The floorboards gave quiet little creaks under my feet. I passed the dresser, the window, the bed, then turned and did it again. "When did you last see that handwritten note?" I asked. "Years ago during a record shuffle. Could you find it? Maybe." "That's not an answer. It's the honest one." I stopped pacing. "Why are you helping me?" This time he answered immediately. "Because I've gotten old enough to know the difference between minding my business and helping bury something that shouldn't stay buried." That one got me. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. It sounded like truth spoken by somebody who had watched too many years go by. I looked down at the Polaroid in my hand. My mother's face. The baby in her arms. That unguarded look. "Do you remember anything else?" I asked. Eddie gave a slow exhale. "Maybe." "What does that mean?" "It means memories don't come back in order, they come back sideways." I waited. He said, "I remember she wasn't wearing a ring." My eyes shifted to the two bands on the bedspread. "Are you sure?" "No," he said, "but I remember noticing her hands because she kept twisting them together." That stuck with me because married women in those days, most of them anyway, wore the evidence, even when they were mad, even when they wanted to take it off. My mouth went dry. The unmarked ring from the bank, not on her hand, in the box, separated from the life everyone knew. "What else?" I asked. He made a thoughtful sound. "There might have been a child." Everything in me went still. "What?" "Not with her, not in the bank, He paused. "I remember hearing Mr. Talbot say something like, 'If this is about the child,' and then he looked up and saw me nearby, and that was the end of hearing anything." I sat back down. The mattress dipped under me. A child, the baby in the photo. Not me. A pulse of heat moved through my chest, sudden and almost angry. Who was that baby? My sibling. Somebody else's child. A child my mother had protected. A child my father had hidden from me. Every possibility felt dangerous. The kind of dangerous that doesn't explode right away. The kind that rearranges your whole life after it arrives. "I need to see whatever records still exist," I said. "You and me both," Eddie replied. "You said Mr. Talbot handled the box. Is he alive?" "No, of course. What about anyone else from the bank?" "Few retired. One moved to Arizona. One's in assisted living and doesn't know Tuesday from pie crust." Despite everything, a small, involuntary sound escaped me. Not quite a laugh, but close. Eddie seemed to hear it. "Yeah," he said, "that's about where we are." I noticed the word. It should have bothered me that a stranger had stepped into this so quickly. It should have felt intrusive. Instead, it felt like the first solid thing I'd touched since morning. "When can you look?" I asked. "Now, if you don't mind digging through old paper with a man whose knees have opinions." I looked toward the window. Evening had nearly settled. The rain had started again, soft but steady, ticking against the glass. Somewhere downstairs, the house let out one of its old settling sighs. Part of me wanted to say no. Not tonight. Not this fast. Not before I had time to sit with what was already happening. But another part, the deeper part, understood something I hadn't wanted to admit. If I stopped now, I might never start again. That was how old family lies survived. Not through brilliance, through exhaustion, through manners, through one more night of saying, "I'll deal with it tomorrow." And I was suddenly terrified of tomorrow. "Where?" I asked. "The bank basement," Eddie said. "They've got archive cabinets waiting to be hauled out. Evelyn can get us in through the side door for another hour, maybe two." I looked at the rings again. The marked one from home, the silent one from the box, two versions of my mother's life, or two lies built close enough to resemble each other. "All right," I said, but before I could hang up, Eddie said, "There's one more thing." I froze. "What?" His voice dropped lower. "When I said I thought your mother came back for that box once, that wasn't the part that really bothered me." The house seemed to quiet around me. Even the rain felt farther away. "What part bothered you?" He answered carefully, each word placed down like something breakable. Whoever she was, she looked like she was afraid somebody had followed her. 25 minutes later, I was back outside Miller's National Bank. Night had come down fully now. Main Street was wet and nearly empty, shop windows glowing dim and yellow across the road. The bank looked larger in the dark, less like a building, and more like a memory that refused demolition. Eddie was waiting under the side awning with a ring of keys clipped to his belt and a dented silver thermos in one hand. He was shorter than I'd imagined, broad in the shoulders, maybe late 60s, with a lined face and thick brows and the kind of posture men get after years of fixing things that resist being fixed. His jacket smelled faintly of machine oil and rain. He lifted the thermos a little when he saw me. "Coffee?" he asked. I shook my head. "Probably wise," he said. "Mine tastes like arguments." That got a real laugh out of me. Brief, unwanted, human. He nodded toward the door. "Good. Means you're still alive in there." Evelyn let us in without much fuss. She looked tired enough not to want details. "You have 90 minutes, she said. "After that, I'm locking up whatever family history decides to crawl out tonight." The basement stairs were narrow and concrete. The air changed halfway down. Colder, damper. A smell of cardboard, dust, rust, and old paper swollen from decades of weather. Fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead in a tired blue-white light. Metal shelves ran in rows, loaded with archive boxes, ledger books, outdated forms, bags of obsolete keys. Eddie unscrewed his thermos and took a sip, then made a face. "Yep," he said. "Still terrible." I followed him between the shelves. Somewhere above us, muffled through the floor, something heavy rolled across the bank lobby. Then silence again. He stopped at a file cabinet with one drawer labeled safe deposit, closed/delinquent/transferred. "Well," he said, setting down the thermos. "Let's go find out how dead your mother really was." And with that, he pulled open the drawer. Inside, near the front, was a thin brown folder. Across the tab, in faded block letters, were 4 words that made my stomach drop so suddenly I had to grab the edge of the cabinet. "Carter Helen Special Hold." For a second, neither of us moved. The basement hummed around us. Old fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Rain tapping somewhere faint through ground-level windows. The metallic smell of filing cabinets and damp paper rising in the cold air. And there it was, a thin brown folder, not thick, not official-looking enough to hold a life, just worn cardboard with soft edges and a tab that had darkened where fingers had touched it over the years. Carter Helen, Special Hold my mother's name, in present tense, in a file that should never have existed if the story I'd been told was true. Eddie looked at me, then at the folder, then back at me again. "You want to do the honors?" he asked. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't want to, because something in me had started to understand that every new piece of paper was going to cost me something. Not just answers, structure, memory, loyalty, the architecture of my whole childhood. Still, I reached for it. The folder was cooler than I expected. Dry, rough. It made a whispering sound as I pulled it free from the drawer. We carried it to a metal work table under the brightest light in the room. The table legs scraped the concrete when Eddie shifted it closer, and the sound bounced off the basement walls like something sharp being dragged from sleep. I opened the folder. Inside were only 6 items. That was the first thing that shocked me. 6. After all these years, after all that fear, all that secrecy, only 6 pieces of paper. But then I remembered the box. How 3 small objects had already been enough to split my life open. It doesn't take much. Just the right things. The first page was a standard deposit record, account opening date, signature line, box number, routine information. My eyes skimmed it too quickly at first, tripping over words without absorbing them. Eddie slid the paper closer to the light and tapped near the bottom. "There," he said, "my mother's signature, or what looked like it. Helen M. Carter." The sight of her name written by her own hand did something strange to me. It was like hearing a dead person clear their throat in the next room. Intimate. Impossible. Her letters leaned slightly forward, neat but not stiff. The capital H had a curved opening stroke I recognized from the recipe card she once wrote for zucchini bread, one of the only pieces of her handwriting I had ever seen. My knees weakened for a second. I had expected evidence. I had not expected her. Not like that. Not in the pressure of a pen line. Not in a signature written by a living wrist. I touched the edge of the page but not the ink. "That's her," I said. Eddie nodded once. He didn't ask how I knew. The opening date was June 1978, 4 months before the crash. I swallowed hard. So my mother had opened the box herself. Not after, not by mistake, not under someone else's name. She had walked into this bank in the summer of 1978 and created a private place inside her own life that no one had ever told me about. Why, that question came first, then the worse one. What was she planning for? The second paper was a payment ledger. Small entries, dates, initials, some years blank, some years marked paid, 1 year stamped delinquent notice issued, another year with grace extended PERMT, Eddie murmured. Talbot, the old manager. I ran my finger down the columns. There it was again, the pattern Evelyn had mentioned. Paid, missed, paid, missed. Not orderly, persistent. Like somebody out there had been holding onto this box the same way people keep a porch light burning for someone who might still come home. And halfway down the page, clipped to the ledger with a rusted staple, was a yellow memo slip, typed at the top, handwritten below. Do not release contents without secondary confirmation. Hold until she's old enough. No name after that. No explanation, just that sentence. My throat tightened so suddenly it hurt. Eddie stepped back a little, giving me room. I read it again, then again. There are moments when words stop behaving like words and become impact instead. Not language, force. This was one of those moments. Hold until she's old enough. That meant me. It had to, unless there was another girl in this story no one had told me about. Another daughter, another child, another missing branch of the family tree. The thought flashed hot and fast through my chest, the baby in the Polaroid. I looked up at Eddie. What if that note isn't about me? He rubbed his jaw. Could be not. That's not helpful. No, he said gently, it's just true. I hated how often truth sounded like that now. Unfinished, evasive. Not because people were lying in the moment, but because so much had been broken into pieces before it ever reached me. I picked up the third item. A folded document on police department letterhead. Not a full report, more like a communication stub. Internal, carbon copy. Dated October 12, 1978, 2 days before the funeral. My heart started beating harder. The paper smelled faintly sour with age, and when I opened it, the crease cracked softly at the center. At the top, vehicle incident, Route 9 corridor. Below that, typed lines describing road conditions, rain, visibility, presumed driver identity. Presumed, I froze on that word. Not confirmed, presumed. I read farther. The phrasing was careful, too careful. Vehicle registered to Thomas Carter, likely operator, spouse. Recovery incomplete due to fire damage and weather exposure. Public statement deferred pending family notification. My mouth went dry. Recovery incomplete. I read the line 3 times to make sure I wasn't bending it into what I feared. I wasn't. Eddie, he leaned in. What? They never wrote that they found a body. He took the paper from me carefully and read it himself. His brows pulled together. No, he said after a beat, they didn't. The fluorescent light seemed suddenly louder, or maybe it was the blood in my ears. For my entire life the crash had been told to me as fact. Finished fact, closed fact, the kind of thing adults deliver with lowered voices and hand squeezes, and that terrible expression people wear when they think finality is kindness. But this wasn't final. This wasn't even certain. This was language built to sound certain from a distance. I sat down hard in the metal chair beside the table. The cold came straight through my coat. I remembered the funeral in fragments. Black umbrellas. Mud on shoes, a woman crying into a handkerchief that smelled like perfume. My father's jaw locked so tightly I thought his teeth might break. A closed casket under church light. Closed, I had been told that was because of the accident, because of the fire, because some things were too terrible for a child to see. But what if the casket had been closed because there was no one inside it worth seeing? The thought was so ugly I hated myself for thinking it, then hated someone else for making me have to. I stood up again. No, I said quietly. No, if there was any uncertainty at all, my father would have said something. He would have had to, wouldn't he? Eddie didn't answer. That was answer enough. The fourth item in the folder was stranger. A withdrawal request form, never completed, partial handwriting. My mother's name written once, then crossed out. A Seattle forwarding address line left blank. The paper had been folded and unfolded enough times that the center was nearly white. At the bottom, in different handwriting, thicker pen, sharper pressure, were the words, "Client advised delay is safest." Safest. Not required. Not procedural. Safest, I looked up slowly. Safe from what? Eddie gave a tiny shake of the head. That word doesn't belong in bank paperwork. No, I said, it doesn't. And yet there it was, not hidden in a memory, not guessed, not emotional, written. My mother had tried to access the box. Someone had delayed her. And whoever wrote that note believed danger existed outside the rules of normal banking. I reached for the fifth paper before I was ready. A local obituary clipping. I nearly laughed when I saw it, because it was so thin, so insultingly thin. 3 short paragraphs, her name. Survived by husband and daughter, memorial service private, donations in lieu of flowers, no description of the accident, no mention of where she was buried, no mention of pallbearers, no church details, no relatives from her side listed. It read less like a goodbye and more like someone trying to close a door without making noise. Was this normal? I asked. For 1978, Eddie shrugged. Maybe. Small towns did things quick sometimes. No, I looked at him. Not this quick. Because I remembered enough to know that even then, deaths collected details. People talked. People baked casseroles and whispered over fences and repeated stories until they hardened into local history. But my mother's death had always been oddly smooth, as if every rough edge had been sanded down before it reached me. The sixth and final item was a photograph, not the Polaroid from the box, a black and white photocopy of a photograph paperclipped to a card. It showed the crashed car, or what was left of it. The image was grainy, mud around the ditch, rain streaking the lens. The vehicle half crumpled, darkened from fire, angled nose down into brush. Ugly, real, smaller than tragedy is supposed to look. My stomach clenched. Across the bottom of the attached card, typed in all caps, were the words, "No visual confirmation possible AT scene." I stared, then handed it to Eddie without speaking. He read it, looked at me, looked back at the card. The silence between us changed shape. Before it had been uncertainty, now it was witness. "You seeing this the same way I'm seeing it?" I asked. Eddie nodded slowly. "Yeah." "Say it." He hesitated. Then, very quietly, "This file doesn't prove your mother died in that car." There it was, out loud. A sentence I had been circling all day. A sentence that, once spoken, could never be packed neatly away again. My mother may not have died in the crash, not as far as the records were concerned, not as far as this folder was concerned, not as far as the people who handled the aftermath were concerned. Then why was I told she did? The question came with another one attached to it like a hook. Who benefited from me believing that? I started gathering the papers into a rough stack, then stopped. At the bottom of the folder, almost glued to the cardboard by time, was one more slip, not official, not filed correctly, just a narrow piece of notepaper folded in half. I pulled it free. The paper was softer than the others, like it had lived in a pocket before it lived in the file. No letterhead, no signature, just one sentence written in hurried blue ink. "If she comes back, call Pastor Reed before you call Thomas." The room seemed to tilt. Thomas was my father. I looked at Eddie. He took the note and I watched him read it twice. "Who's Pastor Reed?" he asked. I was already shaking my head. "I don't know." But the sentence had done its work. Before you call Thomas, not call Thomas immediately, not notify the husband before. As if whoever wrote it believed my father was not the first person who should know if my mother reappeared. As if they feared what would happen if he was. I sat back again, harder this time. My skin felt cold and hot at once. My mind had started moving too fast, trying to build a shape out of fragments. The box, the second ring, the baby in the photograph, the bus ticket after the funeral, the incomplete crash report, the delayed release, the word safest, the note about my father. This was no longer a mystery about whether paperwork had been mixed up. This was a construction, a managed story, and I had been raised inside it. Eddie screwed the cap back onto his thermos without drinking from it. "You all right?" he asked. "No," I said. Then, after a beat, "Keep going." Because that was the terrible thing about truth once it starts. You don't become less afraid, you just become less willing to live without it. We searched the rest of the drawer. Then the one below it, transfer slips, closed account memos, old delinquency notices, stale forms with carbon smudges. My fingers turned gray from paper dust. The backs of my legs ached from standing and standing again. Somewhere upstairs, a door slammed. Then another. The bank was being dismantled, piece by piece, while in the basement my childhood was being taken apart the same way. It must have been close to closing time when Eddie found the next thing. Not in the Carter folder. In a separate file box labeled MISC. Correspondence, hold/forwarding/exception. He pulled out a stack of envelopes tied with string, thumbed through them, then stopped. "Hey." I turned. He was holding a small cream-colored card with a routing stamp across the top. I walked over. The card was addressed to Miller's National Bank. No full letter attached, maybe lost, maybe removed, but the routing line at the bottom was still visible. Forwarding inquiry, Seattle, WA. My heart thudded once hard. Below that, handwritten in the same slanted style I had seen on the deposit signature, were 3 words, "Please do not," and that was it. The rest had been torn away. I took the card from him. My fingers trembled so badly the edges rattled. "Is that her handwriting?" I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know, because I did. The open curve of the P, the long tail on the D, the slight rightward lean. It was hers, or close enough to hers that the difference no longer mattered. My mother had reached toward Seattle, not in theory, not in family myth, on paper, in ink, after she was supposed to be dead. A sound came from the top of the stairs, Evelyn's voice echoing down. 5 minutes, Eddie looked at me. We're not getting much more tonight. But I was barely listening, because my eyes had dropped to the back of the routing card. There in pencil so faint it almost vanished under the fluorescent glare was something written diagonally across the corner. An address, not complete, just Cedar Street, Seattle, and beneath it one name. Reed. I looked up so fast my chair legs screeched across the concrete. "Pastor Reed," I said. Eddie's expression changed, not surprise, recognition. "You think the pastor knew where she went?" "I think," I said, hearing my own voice sharpen, "the pastor may have helped her get there." For the first time all night the mystery stopped feeling cold. It became personal, because pastors don't help women disappear for no reason, not unless there's danger. Not unless there's fear, not unless somebody powerful is standing on the other side of the decision. And suddenly, for the first time since opening that box, I felt something I had not let myself feel before. Not just confusion, not just grief, anger at my father, at the town, at every adult who had stood over my 6-year-old life and decided the cleanest lie was kinder than the messy truth. Evelyn called down again, louder this time. "We're locking up." Eddie began stacking the papers back into order, but I stopped him. "No, I need copies," he grimaced. "Machine upstairs is probably gone. Then I'll take pictures." I pulled my phone from my coat pocket and started photographing everything. The ledger, the memo, the report, the note about Thomas, the Seattle card. My hands were still shaking, so I had to brace my wrists against the edge of the table to steady the frame. Each click felt like theft, or rescue, maybe both. When we finally climbed the basement stairs, the bank felt emptier than before, larger too. The lobby lights had been dimmed. Plastic sheeting covered half the teller counter. A dolly stood abandoned near the vault. The whole place smelled like wet cardboard and old money and endings. Evelyn was waiting by the side door with her coat on. "Find what you needed?" she asked. "No," I said truthfully. Then I held up my phone a little. "But I found enough." Outside, the rain had thinned to a drifting mist again. Streetlights smeared pale yellow over the wet pavement. Across the street, the diner windows glowed warm, and for one ridiculous second I wanted badly to be the kind of person whose biggest decision tonight was pie or no pie. Instead, I stood under the awning with a dead woman's file in my phone, a second wedding ring in my pocket, and a name in my head I had never heard before this night. Pastor Reed. Eddie capped his thermos and shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. "So," he said, "what now?" I looked out at the empty street, at the reflected lights, at a town I had lived in all my life without realizing how much of it had been built around other people's silence. "Now," I said, "I find out why everyone was more afraid of my father than they were of my mother coming back." Eddie nodded once. Then he said, "You might not have to wait long." I turned to him. "What does that mean?" He looked past me toward the curb. A police cruiser had just pulled up in front of the bank. No siren, no lights. Just a slow stop in the rain. The driver's door opened, and an older man in a dark jacket stepped out, looked directly at me and said, "You're Helen Carter's girl, aren't you?" The rain had gone so light it was almost smoke. Streetlights washed the sidewalk in a thin yellow glow. Water trembled in the cracks near the curb. The bank stood behind me half dark and half empty, like it had finally given up pretending it was just a building. And across the wet street a police cruiser sat idling. No lights, no siren, just that low engine hum and one older man stepping out into the mist like he'd been expected by the night itself. He closed the door gently, not like a man arriving to arrest someone, more like a man arriving at a funeral too late to enter cleanly. He was in his 60s, maybe older, broad through the chest, silver at the temples, rain beading on the shoulders of his dark jacket, not quite uniform anymore. Retired, maybe, or working some reduced role the way men in small towns do, when they've spent too long being needed to fully leave. He looked at me for 1 second too long. Then he said, "You're Helen Carter's girl, aren't you?" Not daughter, girl. The word hit old in me. I felt Eddie shift beside me under the awning. "Can I help you?" he asked, not friendly. The man ignored him. His eyes stayed on me. And I knew that look, not because I knew him personally, because I knew what it meant. Recognition mixed with discomfort. The face of someone who had carried a memory long enough for it to harden into guilt. "Yes," I said, "I'm her daughter." The man nodded once slow, "Thought so." A car passed at the far end of Main, tires hissing on wet road. The diner sign buzzed faintly across the street. Somewhere behind us, Evelyn locked the bank's side door and muttered goodnight to no one in particular before disappearing into the lot. And just like that, it was only the three of us in the rain. The man stepped up onto the curb. "I'm Frank Delaney," he said. "Used to be with county law enforcement. Worked the Route 9 corridor back then." Back then. He didn't have to explain which then he meant. October 1978 had already entered the air between us. My mouth went dry. "You were at the crash." He studied my face for a second, as if trying to decide how much of me was my mother and how much was my father. "I was near enough to it," he said. That wasn't an answer, and he knew I knew it. Eddie folded his arms. "You've got a reason for showing up now." Frank glanced at him. "I heard someone was digging through old bank records." Eddie's jaw tightened. "And," Frank looked back at me, "and there are some stories that get uglier the longer they sit." I stared at him. All day people had been giving me fragments, delays, careful half-sentences wrapped in age and caution and local habit. I was too tired for another one. So stop dressing it up, I said. Did my mother die in that crash or not? The question came out sharper than I expected. Good, because I was done speaking softly around other people's lies. Frank didn't answer right away. He removed his glasses, wiped rain from them with 2 fingers and put them back on. A little stalling ritual, a little borrowed time. Then he said, "Not the way you were told." The world did not stop. That's what movies always get wrong. Streetlights kept glowing. Water kept dripping from the awning. Somewhere downtown, a truck changed gears. My own body kept standing there. But inside me, something old and load-bearing cracked all the way through. "Say it plainly," I said. Frank looked at the pavement once, then back at me. "There was a car," he said. "There was damage. There was fire. There was enough confusion to make a clean story convenient. Convenient." I took a step toward him. "Was there a body?" He held my gaze. "No." That word went through me like ice water. No, 1 syllable, 48 years too late. Beside me, Eddie said a curse under his breath. I didn't. I couldn't. Because the truth, once it finally arrives, doesn't always create noise. Sometimes it empties you out first. Sometimes it just leaves you standing there hearing the rain in impossible detail. Every drop, every tiny tick against the metal edge of the awning. "No body," I repeated. Frank nodded. "Then why was there a funeral?" He gave a grim little smile that had no warmth in it. "Because funerals close doors, especially closed casket ones." My stomach turned. I thought of the church again. The polished wood. The smell of lilies and wet coats. My father's hand on my shoulder. The black casket at the front of the room like a statement no one was allowed to question. I had cried over an absence staged to look like certainty, and every adult around me had let me. "Who decided that?" I asked. Frank's face tightened. Now we were getting to the real grave. He looked down Main Street before answering, as if the empty storefronts might still be listening. "Your father had influence," he said. "More than a badge, more than a title. People owed him favors. People feared the wrong kind of attention." That tracked too easily. My father had not been a loud man, not physically threatening, not a monster in the simple, useful sense. But he was one of those men small towns build themselves around, organized, capable, respected in the daylight, and somehow always standing 1 room closer to every decision than everyone else. He knew bank managers by first name. He knew pastors, knew deputies, knew which mechanic would stay late and which newspaper editor would trim details for the family. At the time, I had called that reliability. Now it looked like infrastructure. I said, "What was he covering?" Frank rubbed his jaw. "Back then I didn't know all of it. But you knew enough." A pause. "Yes." The rain thickened for a second, then softened again. Eddie shifted his weight. "Frank, just say the thing." Frank let out a breath. "Your mother was trying to leave." I closed my eyes for 1 second, not because it shocked me, because hearing it aloud made it real in a new way. The box, the ticket, the Seattle forwarding card, the unsigned note, the second ring. She had been trying to leave, not after the crash, before it. "When?" I asked. "For a while," he said. "Long enough that some people knew, not publicly, quietly. Quiet enough that most folks only caught pieces." "Why?" He looked at me, and in that look I saw him weighing mercy against honesty. I had no use left for mercy. "Why?" I asked again. Frank's voice lowered. "Because she believed staying with your father was becoming dangerous." Dangerous. There it was, not unhappy, not strained, not troubled, dangerous. The word seemed to deepen the air. I thought of all the respectable years that had followed my mother's so-called death. The pressed shirts, the church attendance, the casseroles dropped off after other people's funerals, my father fixing neighbors' gutters and shaking hands and paying bills on time, and teaching me that composure was the same thing as goodness. And underneath it, what? What had I not seen because I had been 6? What had been hidden because no one wanted a scandal they couldn't control? What had my mother tried to outrun? "I need specifics," I said. Frank nodded slowly like he had expected that. "I can give you some," he said. "Not all. Some of it was rumor. Some of it was witnessed. Some of it—" He stopped. Some of it was never written down because writing it down would have made people choose a side. That felt horribly believable. Small towns love truth right up until truth demands a cost. He stepped under the awning with us then, finally close enough for me to smell the damp wool of his jacket and the stale coffee on his breath. Your father's family had business interests outside town, he said. Cash moving in ways it shouldn't. Men showing up at odd hours. Deals that had nothing to do with the hardware store or farm equipment or whatever public thing they were using that year. My chest tightened. I had vague childhood memories, strange men in parked cars, my father taking phone calls outside, my mother going still in doorways when certain names were mentioned. At 6, none of that means anything. At 50, it means everything, Frank continued. Your mother found out more than she was supposed to, enough to be frightened, enough to say she wanted you out. You, not just herself, me. Something in my throat burned. She tried to take me, Frank nodded once. That was the problem. The problem, my own life condensed into 2 words. Problem for who? He didn't answer immediately. Then, for the men who thought children made women easier to control. I turned away from him, not out of drama, because rage arrived so fast I needed physical space from it. Across the street, the diner windows glowed warm and blurred in the mist. A waitress was stacking cups inside. Ordinary life continuing in a frame that no longer belonged to me. My mother had tried to take me, and someone had stopped her, not fate, not tragedy, people. Eddie's voice was low now. What happened the night of the crash? Frank took his time answering. There was a vehicle found off Route 9, he said. Registered to your father. Burned bad enough to be useful. The assumption spread fast, faster than facts. By the time anyone questioned details, the family already wanted privacy. The pastor had been called, and your father had people insisting the decent thing was to let a grieving husband grieve. I laughed then. A terrible sound, thin and humorless. A grieving husband. Frank didn't flinch. No, he said quietly, not exactly. That might have been the worst part. Not just that my father lied, that he was helped, buffered, protected by other adults who recognized a dangerous arrangement and still chose the version that kept the machinery running. I said, did my mother stage the crash? Frank shook his head. I don't know who staged what. I know she vanished in the same window the car was found. I know there was pressure to stop asking questions. And I know a few days later there was a funeral with no body and a child too young to know the difference. His eyes held mine when he said that last part, not cruelly, almost apologetically, too late. The cold had started to reach through my shoes from the wet concrete. I barely felt it. What about Pastor Reed? I asked. That got a reaction, small but clear. Frank's brows moved, so he knew the name. He was involved, Frank said carefully. Involved how? I can't prove it. I'm past caring what you can prove. That surprised him. Good, because for too long proof had only served the people who controlled access to it. Frank said Reed was one of the few men in town your father couldn't fully manage, too respected, too separate. If your mother needed help getting somewhere without it becoming public, he's one of the people she might have trusted. Might have. That's the honest word. I hated honest words tonight. They came dressed as caution, and arrived 3 decades late. Eddie asked, is Reed alive? Frank looked at him. No, died about 15 years back. Of course, another dead man with living answers. But, Frank added, his wife might be. I turned sharply. What? She moved west after he passed. I heard Seattle maybe, near their daughter. Every nerve in me seemed to tighten at once. Seattle, the bus ticket, the forwarding inquiry, the torn address card, Cedar Street, not random, not anymore. Do you know her name? I asked. Frank nodded. Margaret Reed. I took my phone out so fast I nearly dropped it. Spell it. He did. I typed it into my notes with wet fingers. Margaret Reed, Seattle, Cedar Street. For a moment the whole case seemed to narrow from a storm into a road. A real road. One that might actually lead somewhere. But then Frank said, there's something else. I looked up. His face had changed again. This was the part he least wanted to give me. What? He shifted his jaw once before speaking. Your mother may have tried to come back. The words hit so hard they almost didn't land. What? I never saw her myself, he said quickly. But there was talk, quiet talk, a sighting near town, a woman matching her description, nervous, keeping to side streets. This would have been months later, maybe a year, not sure. Eddie glanced at me. The bank, Frank nodded once. Could be. My heartbeat went strange, not faster, heavier. She came back for me, I asked. Frank looked genuinely pained then. That, he said, I don't know. That question opened something raw, because until now there had still been a sliver of emotional distance in the mystery. Evidence, files, timelines, systems. But this was different. If she came back, then she had tried. Maybe she stood on a sidewalk I had walked later as a teenager. Maybe she looked toward my school. Maybe she watched the house. Maybe she reached as close to me as she could without setting off the danger she had fled. Or maybe she didn't. Maybe she came back for the box, for documents, for money, for proof, for another child, for anything except me. And that uncertainty hurt more than the silence had. Frank must have seen some of that pass across my face, because his voice softened. There are a lot of reasons a woman in that situation might not make contact. I looked at him. There is no good reason to let your child believe you're dead. He took that and didn't fight it. Maybe not, he said, but there are reasons that feel bigger than good when you're afraid. That sentence stayed between us for a long time. Finally, Eddie spoke. So what now? Frank looked from him to me. If you keep going, he said, don't go back to Route 9 first. Go west. Seattle, of course, not the grave. The escape route, not where the lie was built, where the truth fled. He reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. I almost threw this out years ago, he said. Couldn't bring myself to. He handed it to me. The paper was thin and soft with age. I unfolded it carefully under the awning light. It was a torn page from a memo pad. On it, in hurried handwriting that made my pulse jump before I even consciously recognized why, were 2 lines. M. Read 1724 Cedar Street, Seattle. Below that, in smaller writing, ask about Helen, not Thomas. My breath caught. The handwriting, even in the dim light, even after all the years, even on a scrap. It matched the signature in the file, my mother's. For one suspended second, the whole world seemed to pull inward around that paper. She had been real. After the crash, she had been real. In Seattle, she had been real, not legend, not error, not wish. A woman with handwriting, a plan, an address, a living future I had been denied. I looked up at Frank. Where did you get this? He answered quietly. It was in the crash file, then it wasn't. A sick understanding moved through me. Somebody had removed it, somebody had kept it, and now, all these years later, it was back in my hand. Why give it to me now? I asked. Frank's eyes held mine. Because I was there when the truth got buried, he said, and I'd rather not die having helped keep it under. No one spoke after that. The rain whispered against the street. A neon sign buzzed. The cruiser engine idled low and patient. Beside me, Eddie took the thermos cap off and then put it back on without drinking. Even he seemed to understand the moment had gone beyond commentary. I folded the paper once, then again, and slipped it into my coat pocket beside the unmarked ring. Seattle, Cedar Street, Margaret Reed. For the first time since the phone call that morning, I was no longer standing in pure mystery. I had direction, and direction can be more terrifying than confusion, because confusion lets you wait. A road does not. Frank stepped back toward his cruiser. If you go, he said, be prepared for the truth to be smaller than the hurt and bigger than the lie. Then he got in and shut the door. A moment later, the cruiser pulled away into the wet dark without lights, without drama, disappearing at the end of Maine like one more secret finally deciding it had done enough damage here. Eddie let out a long breath. Well, he said, voice rough, that's one hell of a Tuesday. I looked at him. Despite everything, despite the rawness in my chest and the shaking in my hands that almost made me smile. Almost. Then he tilted his head toward the diner across the street. You should eat something before you drive home and reinvent your entire childhood. That did make me smile. A small one, tired, real, and maybe that's why I trusted him. Not because he had answers, because he kept making room for me to keep moving toward them. We crossed to the diner in silence. The bell over the door jingled too cheerfully when we entered. Heat wrapped around us at once: coffee, grilled onions, pie crust, old fryer oil, wet coats steaming dry. Ordinary life. Bright and blunt, and almost offensive in its normality. We took a booth by the window. I set my phone on the table, then the envelope from the bank. Then, after a moment, I took the 2 rings out and placed them side by side between the sugar jar and the napkin dispenser. The one from home, the one from the box. 2 circles, 2 versions of a marriage, 2 versions of a life, 2 truths that had never been allowed to touch. Eddie looked at them, then at me. "You okay?" he asked again. I stared at the rings. "No," I said. Then I looked out through the rain-silvered diner window toward the dark street beyond. "But tomorrow," I said, "I'm going to Seattle." And for the first time in my life, when I thought of my mother, I did not picture a gravestone. I pictured a door, somewhere on Cedar Street, an old house, a porch light, a woman opening it. And the most terrifying thought of all, what if she recognizes me before I recognize her? Because if my mother died in 1978, who had been living all this time? I did not sleep that night. I lay in bed with the address on the nightstand beside me and watched darkness slowly turn gray at the edges of the window. The house made its old sounds, pipes ticking, floorboards settling, wind brushing the siding. Every few minutes I would close my eyes and see the same 3 things again. The ring, the baby, the ticket, then the 4th thing. 1724 Cedar Street, Seattle. By dawn, the question had changed. Not did my mother live, now it was, what kind of life did she have to build without me? The drive west felt longer than it should have. Long enough for every mile to turn one memory into 3. The highway hummed under the tires. Gas station coffee tasted like burnt cardboard. Rain came and went in weak silver sheets across the windshield. Pine trees darkened the roadside in long, wet stretches, and every few towns I passed a church sign or a boarded motel or a diner with fogged windows, and all of it made the country feel too full of places where women could disappear if they were frightened enough. I kept both rings in the cup holder beside me, the one from my jewelry box, the one from the bank. Every time I stopped, I looked at them again, as if they might settle something before I got there. They never did. Seattle appeared under a low ceiling of cloud just after noon. Wet streets, hills, faded row houses, traffic whispering over slick pavement. The city smelled like rainwater, gasoline, salt, and coffee drifting out of corner cafes when the doors opened. I found Cedar Street in a neighborhood full of old, narrow homes, with deep porches and small front gardens trying to hold on through early spring. The address led me to a pale blue house with white trim and a short brick path darkened by rain. There were clay pots on the steps, rosemary in one, something flowering in another. A wind chime moved softly under the porch roof, making a sound like glass touched by breath. I parked across the street and didn't get out. Not at first, because after all the paper, all the clues, all the years, there it was, a real house, real windows, a real mailbox, the kind of place that belongs to the living. I stared at the front door and felt fear arrive in layers. What if I was wrong? What if Margaret Reed opened it and said the name meant nothing? What if my mother had lived here and died last year, and I had driven all this way only to become late again? And the worst one, what if she was here? What if she opened that door and her face answered every question except the one I had carried longest? Why didn't you come back for me? A city bus sighed to a stop at the corner, then moved on. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked twice and fell quiet. Water dripped rhythmically from a gutter. I could smell damp earth from the gardens and the faint clean scent of someone's laundry venting into the cold air. Then I saw movement in the side yard. An elderly woman in gardening gloves was bent over a row of planters near the porch steps. Gray hair pinned up loosely, heavy sweater, slow, careful movements. She reached for a trowel, paused as if her back hurt, then straightened halfway and brushed soil from her palm. It took me 1 second to know she was not my mother, and one more to know she knew something. I got out of the car. My legs felt unreliable on the wet pavement. I crossed the street, opened the little gate, and walked up the brick path while the wind chime gave one thin note above me. The woman turned when she heard my shoes. Her face was lined and kind and sharply alert in the eyes. She took me in all at once, coat, wet hair, clenched hands, the expression people wear when they are holding themselves together one sentence at a time. "Yes," she said, my throat tightened. "Are you Margaret Reed?" A pause, then, "I am," I swallowed. "My name is Claire Carter." The trowel slipped from her hand and landed softly in the wet dirt. Not dramatic, not loud, but enough. Enough to tell me I had come to the right door. For a second she said nothing. Then her mouth parted slightly and all the color changed in her face. "Oh," she whispered. That one word nearly undid me, not because it answered everything, because it carried recognition. Not "Who are you?" Not "I'm sorry, you have the wrong house." Recognition, like my name had arrived long before I did. "You know who I am," I said. Margaret looked toward the front window of the house, then back at me. Rain tapped softly on the porch roof. "Yes," she said. My voice came out rougher now. "Is she here?" Margaret closed her eyes for a brief second. When she opened them, they were wet. "Yes," she said again. I did not move. The whole world seemed to gather itself into the space between that answer and my next breath. Inside the house, somewhere beyond the blue-painted door, was the woman I had buried before I knew enough to doubt a casket. My mother alive, old now, real. I felt my body sway and caught the porch rail with one hand. The wood was damp and cold. Margaret stepped forward instinctively, but I shook my head. "No, I'm okay." It was a lie. But it got me standing through the next 10 seconds, and that was all I needed. Margaret looked toward the front door again. "She doesn't know you're coming," she said softly. I almost laughed. Neither did I. Margaret picked up the trowel, set it aside, pulled off her gloves, and opened the door. Warmth met us first. A house smell. Tea, old books, cedar, and something baking, maybe apples or cinnamon. Quiet light filled the front room. Lamps on. Rain at the windows. A knitted blanket draped over the arm of a chair. On a side table sat reading glasses, seed packets, and a mug with a teabag string hanging over the rim. It was such an ordinary room. That hurt in its own way. Ordinary means years. Ordinary means routines. Ordinary means she had gone on becoming a person while I was still talking to a gravestone. "Wait here," Margaret whispered. But before she could take another step, a voice came from deeper in the house. "Margaret, did you find my—" The voice stopped. So did everything else. She appeared in the doorway between the hall and the front room with a folded dish towel in one hand. Older, yes, much older, but time had not erased her, it had translated her. The same mouth, the same line of the jaw, the same way her shoulders held still first when she was shocked. Her hair was white now, cut shorter than in any picture I had ever seen. Her face held years I had not witnessed. Sorrow too, but her eyes, I knew those eyes. I knew them from the backyard photo on my hallway table, from the Polaroid in the bank box, from my own face in the mirror when I am too tired to hide what I feel. The dish towel slipped from her hand. "Claire," she said, not a question. My name broke in her voice exactly where mine had broken all day. And that was it. That was the moment. Not dramatic music. Not running. Not some impossible movie embrace across the room. Just a woman saying my name like she had been carrying it in silence for nearly 50 years, and no longer had the strength to keep carrying it alone. I should tell you I ran to her. I didn't. I stood there shaking. Because love was there, yes, but so was everything else. All the birthdays she missed, all the funerals, all the school plays, every sick day, every question. Every night I had tried to imagine whether the dead could still hear you if you talked hard enough. My voice came out thin. "You let me bury you." My mother flinched like I had struck her. Good. I had not driven across 2 states to protect anyone from the shape of this. Her hand went to her mouth. She nodded once. Then again smaller. "I know," she whispered. "You let me believe you were dead." Tears had already gathered in her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I know." Why? That word filled the room, not loud, worse than loud. It carried 6 years old and 50 years old at the same time. Why? Margaret quietly left us then, disappearing toward the kitchen with the instinctive grace of someone who has understood for years that some grief can only happen in private. My mother took 1 step forward, then stopped when she saw I wasn't ready. "I need you to sit down," she said. I laughed once, a sharp, unbelieving sound. "No, I need you to answer me." She closed her eyes. When she opened them, they held something I had not expected. Not defensiveness, terror remembered. "Because if I had come back for you then," she said, "they would have found us both." The room went still. Rain moved at the windows in soft streaks. A kettle clicked somewhere in the kitchen as it finished heating. And my mother, my dead mother, my living mother, stood 3 steps away from me and finally began to tell the truth. She said my father had changed slowly, then all at once. That was how she put it. At first it was temper, control, friends she was not supposed to ask about, business she was not supposed to understand, men coming by late, locked drawers, calls taken outside. A world built just beyond the walls of the marriage, close enough to poison it, hidden enough to deny. Then came the fear, not only of him, of the people attached to him, his family, their money, their arrangements, the things they moved, the threats they made indirectly, the way they spoke about loyalty as if it were a debt collected with interest. She found papers she was never meant to find, names, numbers, roots. She realized my father's family was tied to things that would destroy more than reputation if exposed. When I told him I wanted to leave, she said, he wasn't surprised. That was the worst part. It was as if he'd been waiting for me to become a problem. A problem. The same word Frank had used. My hands clenched at my sides. She went on. She tried to take me quietly. She made plans. She hid small cash amounts. She opened the bank box because she needed one place my father did not control. The ring, the photo, the ticket, those were not random keepsakes. They were pieces of a split life, evidence, memory, insurance. The second ring was the ring she wore when she stopped wearing the inscribed one from my father. "The day I took it off," she said, "was the day I accepted I was no longer trying to save the marriage. Only you. The baby in the Polaroid was not my sibling. It was Margaret Reed's granddaughter, an infant my mother helped care for while hiding briefly with the Reeds before she fled west. The photograph had been taken in that house by Margaret's husband, Pastor Reed. On the back, 'For when she asks,' meant me. She told me one day you would ask who she really was by the end," Margaret said quietly from the kitchen doorway, and I had not even heard her return. "Not the version you were allowed to remember." Then came the hardest part. My mother said the crash had not been her plan exactly. But when a wrecked Carter family car was found on Route 9 during the same window she was trying to disappear, certain people around my father chose to use it. A dead woman was easier than a runaway wife. A funeral was easier than an investigation. And once the story hardened, she was told through Pastor Reed and others that if she surfaced too soon, my father's family would come after me first. "Not to kill you," she said, voice breaking. "To use you, to pull me back, to make me cooperate. They knew exactly what would bring me to heel." So she stayed gone. Not because it hurt less. Because it hurt exactly enough to work. I turned away from her then. Not because I didn't believe her.